A lot of us know about the Titanic, whether you learned about it in school or from movies or TV shows. People used to say that the ship was unsinkable, but it hit an iceberg and sank to the bottom of the northern Atlantic Ocean. When the Titanic sank, more than 500 people died. The unsinkable Molly Brown was the one of which only 706 people who made it out alive. Many people still think, though, that the Titanic did not really hit an iceberg. One of these people was there and saw the Titanic sink. As a survivor talks about what happened to her, we get to hear another account of what happened on the Titanic. If this is your first time here, please help us out by clicking the subscribe button and the bell button so that you can get more posts like this one. Most people who think about the Titanic's loss think that the iceberg was the only thing that caused it to sink. It was actually a lot of other things that caused the Titanic to sink, some of which were there before the ship even left port. There were many choices that could have been made that would have changed what happened when the Titanic hit the iceberg. Even if one of the problems this post talks about had been fixed, the Titanic might not have sunk or the number of deaths might not have been as high. Could the Titanic have been going too fast? Many historians think that the Titanic was going too fast because they knew there were icebergs in the area at the time of the accident. It was traveling at 22 knots or 25 mph. Captain Edward Smith probably didn't want to be late getting to New York, which is why he didn't slow down even though people told him to. Ships often want to move as fast as they can when the weather is good when they're crossing the Atlantic. If a ship can make up time early in the trip, it will have some extra time if it has to slow down later because of bad weather. This is because fog is typical in the Atlantic. At the time, some reports said that the Titanic was trying to set a new speed mark. However, this has since been thrown out. People were more interested in how fast the Olympic and Titanic were than how nice their finishes were. Still, they had to stick to a plan, so the ship was going at its normal service speed to make sure they met their deadline. We weren't looking for records that night or that trip. William Charles Herbert Lightoller said, even though a lot has changed in construction since the Titanic, cruise ships today only go a little faster than the Titanic. While the Titanic was not like most current cruise ships, it did serve a unique purpose. The Titanic was an ocean liner whose job was to take people from point A to point B. Modern cruise ships, on the other hand, focus on the experience of being on board. What made them think the Titanic couldn't sink? When the Titanic set sail in 1912, a lot of people thought she would never sink, in part because she was built with sealed sections. At the time, newspapers and magazines spread the idea of being unsinkable even more. Edward Smith, who was 62 years old and was captain of the Titanic, had been captain of the Olympic, which was the sister ship of the Titanic. He had been working at sea for 40 years. The Olympic had an accident with a warship before and was able to get to port without too much trouble. The crew of the Titanic may not have been worried about the chance of a collision because this may have supported the idea that the ship was unsinkable. Fear made people not do any safety drills on the ship before it sank. On the 14th, there was supposed to be a safety drill, but there was instead a church service. Every guest on a modern cruise ship has to go through a safety drill on the first day of their trip. However, the Titanic passengers didn't go through one, so they didn't know where to go or what to do in an emergency. If there were proper emergency processes in place, more people might have been saved. What was wrong with the Titanic's lifeboats? There were no rules in 1912 that said a ship had to have enough lifeboats for every guest. The Titanic's decks had enough room for enough lifeboats for every passenger, but the ship's builders didn't want them there because they looked bad. There was room for 3,120 people on the Titanic, and there were 20 lifeboats, which could hold 1,178 people. In fact, only 705 people were saved by lifeboats. Thanks to new laws, cruise ships must make sure that there is enough room in the lifeboats for all of their guests, plus a lot more in case the lifeboats get damaged. The first lifeboats to leave the Titanic were not full. largely because people were too sure of themselves. A lot of people on the ship thought it would be safer to stay there. No one on the boat knew it was going to sink, and not many people jumped into the lifeboat when they had the chance. They believed leaving the ship was more dangerous. When she left Southampton, the Titanic was already on fire. A fire was going on in the coal bunker in Boiler Room 5 in the days before the Titanic sank. This fire started when the ship left Southampton on April 10th and didn't go out until the day before it sank. It was said to have started on its own. Fred Barrett and Charles Hendrickson, two firefighters, say that they didn't start digging for coal until after the ship left Southampton. At the time, the ship's rules and uniform regulations were in place. They said, "Before going home for the day, the senior engineers of each watch must check the coal bunkers and write down what they find on the log slate. If they see any signs of spontaneous combustion, they must tell the chief engineer right away, who will then tell the commander." Rules for ships and uniform laws. The bunker was 3 stories high and was cleared out on April 13th. Crew members who were in charge of the fire said that they could see how the fire had warped the water. Tight bulkhead that ran along the side of the cave. Since coal can catch fire at around 400 C, 750 F, the temperature inside the coal bunker would have been at least that hot. Everything was off where it had been red hot. The paint was flaking off. It had a few dents and was bent. As a fireman, Charles Hendrickson. If something were to happen with the ship, the watertight tanks would keep the water in one place. Some reports say that the weak bulkhead was already letting water in before the crash. There were rumors that the fire had been going since the ship left Belfast, but it's likely that it wasn't true. It took 1,880 tons of coal from Belfast to load the Titanic, and another 4,427 tons were added in Southampton. A lot of historians say that the crew wouldn't have added more coal to a bunker that was already on fire. The fire probably began in Southampton more than anywhere else. Other theories explain that. The Titanic didn't listen to other ships' ice warnings. The captain was told about ice warnings from other ships in the area during the day, and he or she took the right steps. The ship was still going 22 knots fast. Officer Charles Lightoller said that the ship would have slowed down a lot, or even stopped if the message had been sent to the captain. After an hour, at 10:30 p.m., the Californian sent out another warning. There was ice all around the Californian, so she stopped sailing because she didn't think it was safe to keep going. The radio workers on the Titanic were busy at the time, so they told the Californian that they were taking calls but couldn't answer right away. The person from California stopped talking at this point. The question is, why did no one on the Titanic see the iceberg? The Titanic's watchers didn't see the iceberg because it was still outside and there was no moon that night. The Titanic had 2 lookouts in the crow's nest, which was 29 meters above the deck. Neither of them had glasses. Fred Fleet and Reginald Lee were the lookouts on the night of the accident. Their job was to look for any danger. The water was very still because it was a calm night. If it had been a rougher night, the watchers might have seen waves breaking at the base of the iceberg. David Blair, the second cop, had the key to the box where the binoculars were kept. The ship crossed the Atlantic, and David was moved off of it. He forgot he had the key, so he didn't hand it over. The watchers didn't have glasses, which might have helped them see the iceberg faster. A lot of people think that the passengers on the Titanic felt a big crash when it hit the iceberg. Some people didn't even notice that it wasn't the case. It was just a little jar, a very small bump. Nothing at all. We didn't think much of it. We just picked up the ice and most of us played snowballs. Survivor of the Titanic says, "Why didn't the Titanic turn faster?" When William Murdoch saw the iceberg, he told the crew to turn hard left and stop the engines. The Titanic could not dodge the iceberg because it was too big and moving too fast. Some scientists think that the Titanic might have been able to avoid hitting the iceberg if the order to stop the engines hadn't been given. "Hard a starboard, full speed astern!" yelled Murdoch, who was in charge of the watch. He planned to move the head hard the other way to move the stern further forward. This would clear the bow. It was too late at that speed. The blades stopped turning when the engines shut off, and water wouldn't have been pushing on the rudders. If this had kept going instead of ending, even for a short time, it would have been enough to get the ship out of harm's way or at least lessen the damage. People on the Titanic were told there was nothing to worry about even after it hit the iceberg. What if I told you that there's even more guesswork about this subject? Well, get close. Experts say the Titanic sank because of a huge fire that was out of control, not an iceberg. As new evidence comes out to support the idea, experts say that the RMS Titanic may have sunk because of a huge fire on board, not because it hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic. This happened in April 1912, on its way from Southampton to New York. More than 2,500 people were on board. People have long thought that the iceberg was to blame for the accident, but new evidence shows that there was a fire in the ship's hull that went unnoticed for almost 3 weeks before it happened. Experts have previously agreed with the idea that there was a fire on board, but new study based on rarely seen photos has led them to believe that the fire was the main reason the ship sank. Journalist Sinan Maloney has been researching the sinking of the Titanic for more than 30 years. He looked at pictures taken by the ship's top electrical engineers before it left Belfast shipyard. On the front right side of the hull, just behind where the iceberg went through the ship's lining, Mr. Maloney said he could see 30-foot-long black marks. We are looking at the exact spot where the iceberg got stuck, and we see a weakness or damage to the hull there, before she even left Belfast, he said. In the end, experts agreed that the marks were probably caused by a fire that started in a 3-story fuel store behind one of the boiler rooms. 12 men tried to put out the fire, but it got too big to handle and reached temperatures of up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. After that, the Titanic's steel body was so weak that the ship's lining tore open when it hit the ice. It was said that J. Bruce Ismay, head of the company that built the Titanic, told the ship's officers not to tell any of the 2,500 passengers about the fire. Mr. Maloney presented his study in a Channel 4 documentary called Titanic, The New Evidence, which aired on New Year's Day. He also said that the ship was turned around in its berth in Southampton so that passengers wouldn't be able to see the damage the fire was doing to the side of the ship. Mr. Maloney said the disaster was called an act of God by the official Titanic inquiry. Going over an iceberg and sinking isn't the only thing going on in this story. It's a perfect storm of unusual events. Fire, ice, and criminal negligence all at once. No one has looked into these marks before. It changes the story completely. Experts in metallurgy tell us that that temperature makes steel brittle and weakens it by up to 75%. People knew about the fire, but they played it down. She should not have been sent out to sea. According to Ray Boston, who has studied the Titanic's trip for more than 20 years, the coal fire started during speed trials up to 10 days before the ship left Southampton. This was in 2008. He said that the fire could lead to serious explosions below decks before it got to New York. Parliament was given a report on the disaster in 1912, which said that the ship was going high speed through dangerous icy waters, leaving the crew little time to escape the fatal collision. So, what do you think really led to the sinking of the Titanic? Is it due to the collision with an iceberg or due to a fire incident? Or possibly something else? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to click the video on your screen.